Well, Lord, take my lips and speak through them. Take our minds and think through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire for love's sake. Amen. Last Sunday we heard the story of Jesus' baptism as recounted in the Gospel of Matthew. And during that sermon last week, I said that 3 of the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, recount that baptism story. But this morning we hear from the 4th Gospel, the Gospel of John, which is very different from the other 3. And in the first half of what we've heard read today, we get the only allusion in John to the baptism of Jesus, when we're told that John the Baptist sees the Spirit descending upon Jesus like a dove. And then the second half of this morning's Gospel is focused on the calling of the first disciples. And as I prayed upon this passage this past week, it's this section of the reading that really caught my attention. Because I believe that the calling of these disciples, the description we get in John, is so very experiential, relational, and interpersonal. For we're told that a couple of John the Baptist's disciples begin to follow after Jesus. And he turns around and he asks them what they're looking for. And they tell him that they want to know where he's going. And then Jesus says to them, I love this invitation. Jesus says to them, come and see. Come and see. I think that would be a lovely invitation to communion at the altar. Come and see. Then we're told that one of those disciples, the disciple Andrew, after having this encounter with Jesus, goes and gets his brother and brings him to Jesus. And we're told that the disciple that Andrew brings becomes the disciple known to the world as Peter. Well, I believe that this accounting of the calling of the first disciples in John's Gospel lifts up for us in a very elemental but important way what evangelism is really all about. Now, it must be said here that we in the Episcopal Church are not known as a very evangelical denomination. In a former diocese of mine, a canon at our cathedral actually wrote a little pamphlet for Episcopalians titled Shy Person's Guide to Evangelism. Because we tend to be a pretty introverted bunch when it comes to talking about our faith in public places, telling people about Jesus, even inviting people to come to church. And I think part of the reason is because we don't want to come across as an evangelical. And I think that has nothing to do with what that word evangelical actually means, but rather we don't want to associate ourselves with a certain group of Christians who try to bring people to Jesus by threatening them, by saying not come and see, but come and be saved. And I think those are 2 very different kinds of invitations. But what we have to realize is that that word evangelical simply means somebody who witnesses to the good news of the gospel, to the love of God that we have come to know in Jesus. And so to practice evangelism is to share that with others, to share the hope that is in our hearts, to tell people about our experience of the living God, and to invite people to come and see. At a very basic level, that's what evangelism is all about. And as I was reminded this week, it could be argued that the whole of Christian history, all of Christian theology, is based upon this: people telling other people about their experience of Jesus, down through the generations. It can seem very ordinary, but it can be absolutely transformational. This weekend, of course, we celebrate and give thanks for the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., an icon of the civil rights movement. But in light of our gospel reading this morning from John, I also find myself giving thanks for the men and women in Dr. King's life that made him the extraordinary Christian that he was. I find myself giving thanks for the men and women who also were very much a part of that movement. The men and women who marched with him, who struggled with him, who sacrificed with him for the cause of justice and peace. I believe that Martin Luther King would be the first person to point past himself, not only to God, but to his companions on the way. Which leads me to the case of the Reverend Dr. Prathia Hall. Prathia Hall, who was also an activist in the civil rights movement, who worked alongside Dr. King. Prathia Hall, who Martin Luther King once said was the only speaker he would not want to follow. It is said that Prathia Hall was at a commemoration in the early 1960s for a black church that had been burned to the ground by the Ku Klux Klan. Prathia Hall was at this commemoration that was also attended by Dr. King. And during this service of worship, she got up in the gathered congregation and began to pray. And as she prayed through the power of the Spirit, Prathia Hall began to say, "I have a dream. I have a dream. I have a dream." And it is said that that encounter, that moment, is the moment that inspired Martin Luther King to pen his famous "I Have a Dream" speech that he delivered during the March on Washington in 1964. Prathia Hall is, of course, not remembered by history the way Martin Luther King was, but she nevertheless had an enormous impact on him and the movement, and by extension, the wider world, because she was, in the best sense of the word, an evangelical Christian, because she shared the hope that was within her, because she was unafraid to witness to the love of Jesus and to walk the walk in the public square. We don't remember the disciple Andrew nearly as much as we remember the disciple Peter. But as John's gospel tells the story, Andrew evangelizes Peter. It's Andrew who's responsible for bringing his brother Peter to Jesus. We are all called to be evangelical Christians. We can't allow other people to lay sole claim to that word, because we are all called to witness to the love of God that we have come to know in Jesus. Share the hope that is within us, to tell people about our experience of the living God, and to invite others to come and see. To come and see. I once heard it said that statistically, the average person sitting in a church pew is not there because of the sermon. They're not there because of the style of worship. They're not even there because of the character of the community. They are there because someone that they knew, a family member, a friend, a co-worker, invited them to come to church, invited them to come and have an experience of the living God. We all can make an enormous difference when we take the risk of going out into the world and sharing the hope that is within us. The world's desperate to hear a hopeful message, and we all can play a role. So may God give us the grace and the strength to claim that word, to be evangelical Christians, to go out and witness to the love of God in the public square. not only for the sake of the church, but for the world. Amen.